Today we have Lewis Cardinal here speaking on the spirit and intent of treaties. Lewis has been doing lots of work in his community and around Alberta and around Canada, even around the world, I think. And the work he's doing with Alberta Council of Women's Shelter has been really invaluable to us and our members. And we thank him very much for his efforts. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Of course, I'm very grateful for the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters and the work that they do and the ongoing work that we're doing to improve relations and to ensure that our shelters are well supported to the best of our abilities anyway. And a part of the conversation today is about a broader perspective on these on treaties, and a number of people have a peripheral understanding of what treaties are. A lot of news broadcasts talk about treaties, but usually in a combative spirit. It never really gets down to what treaties are, what they stand for from the Indigenous perspective, or how we see relationships shaped by treaties here in Canada. So it's something that is really important for us to understand the very essence of what treaties are about. So the topic is about the spirit and intent of treaties, because while we do look at treaties and are known as legal agreements, et cetera, there's a lot more to it than I think that we really understand as the general Canadian population. I want to start back to the first contact, the first words in the first 200 years of what has become known as Canada. The stories and the history talks about how the first settlers, when they came to Canada, the first explorers, of course, the fundamental question at the time was, what do you call this place? Where are we? Sort of thing. And through various hand gestures and coming to understanding, they understood that Kanata was where they were at. And so, or more specifically, the word Kanatan was said, because when they asked, what do you call this place? The response was Kanatan, which means a clean, pure, and sacred place. And in reference to the snow on the trees, the purity of the land, Kanatan then signifies a place, this location. So Kanatan was the first word that was written down that identified what would become known as Canada. Because when you shorten the word Kanatan to Kanata, it means to make pure, clean, and sacred. So in fact, Kanata becomes a verb. It becomes a directive in terms of ensuring that your relationship with your environment, with other people, with nature, with the cosmos, with the spirit world are all being worked on continuously to ensure that we can move towards that idea of purity, sacredness, and good relations. And when we started to have these conversations with the newcomers, of course, a part of our tradition as an Indigenous people, recognizing that Kanata was the principle in terms of how we needed to have relationships with the newcomers. It was a part of our processes as Indigenous people is to make peace and treaties. The peacemaking and treaty-making processes of Indigenous people were fairly consistent. It was almost necessary in order for us to live somewhat in balance and harmony with each other. Not to say that Indigenous people, live in a utopian worldview, but we try to make the effort to maintain that balance and that history. And human beings will, from time to time, take too much, become destructive, et cetera, because that seems to be the part of the nature of our collective humanity. So there was a long tradition of peacemaking and treaties that had existed with Indigenous nations for a very long time. Because treaty making is a sacred covenant. It's witnessed by the Creator, as they say. And I'm fortunate enough to descend from a number of treaty makers here in northern Alberta. Treaty 8, Mustus and Canusio were brothers who made Treaty 8 come together. And when they made that treaty, they did it in a ceremonial way as well. It wasn't just signing a piece of paper. It was much more than that. My other descendant, Michelle Calahoo, was a signatory to Treaty 6 here in the Treaty 6 area, as well as my fourth great uncle, Papas Chase, who was also a signatory to Treaty 6. But treaty, when we look at it and understand it, it's really like sacred text. It's a deep covenant between nations of people. When we were at the treaty-making processes, both in Treaty 6 and Treaty 8, for example, we had ceremony. A part of our due process was to ensure that we had ceremony, the smoking of the sacred pipe, for example, and how we would made our commitment in a very deep way. And a part of the treaty-making process, as I was told by my great-grandfathers, was that we had to do it when the sun was perfectly above us, because that's when the Creator can see, and that there are no shadows where we can hide doubt or insincerities. So it was very ceremonial. It wasn't just, again, like touching the pen or making the X. These treaties took a very long time to make. They were brought together by years of dialogue and discussions amongst Indigenous nations in terms of how we were going to have our relationship with the newcomers. But also what is important is that these peace and friendship treaties, as we have come to know them, which is really the foundation of all the treaties that we have today, is that we are looking after one another. So this covenant brings us into a very special relationship with the newcomers. And as you'll see in reports from commissioners, is that they've always referred to this relationship as like brothers and sisters, like family. In fact, it becomes more of that relationship in a familial way. The age of alliances and the birth of Crown treaties, really we can look back to as early as 1613, the two-row wampum, which was a peace and friendship treaty. It's a recognized treaty between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Five Nations, and the Dutch. And when you see the wampum belt that is there, this is a replica of the ancient wampum belt that is still being held and cared for. And you'll see the two stripes, two purple stripes, and this was made out of sacred wampum shells. And the two stripes represent two vessels, the Indigenous one and the settler one, and that these two vessels would move together along the great river of life, sharing the river of life, sharing the bounty, respecting each other as we travel together on this river of life. And it recognizes that Indigenous people had their own destiny and that they had the right to steer that destiny according to what they needed to do. But also we recognize that the newcomers had their own destiny. We would not get into their ship and try to steer it for them or say where they should go or where we thought they should go. And neither would they climb into our vessel, into our canoes, and tell us how we should be steering it. So that was a foundational understanding, the first peace and friendship treaties that started out in the eastern seaboard of Canada. So the peace and the prosperous coexistence was necessary first to have a relationship with these newcomers. A trading relationship usually started out the relationship between the newcomers and Indigenous people. So the two-row wampum was that first relationship statement, that relationship understanding. Then we have what was called the covenant chain. And it is a series of treaties that were made in Eastern Canada. But the covenant chain, as you can see at on the picture of this belt, is that it connected these two ships together, connected them in peace, respect, and friendships. And throughout the early 1700s, right up until 1779, in fact, the Iroquois and other nations joined in the concepts of the covenant chain, bringing together the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together to share and to learn from each other and to be friends. And it's interesting to note that since these treaty-making processes started, with the two Roe Wampum, then followed by the Covenant Chain treaties and treaty processes, is that there's a consistent message that comes out. Two consistent messages, actually. One is that these relationships would last as long as the sun shines, the waters flow, and grass grows. And right up to Treaty 8 and Treaty 11, these are major statements that Indigenous people had reiterated over and over again. But also the other statement is about being like brothers and sisters, recognizing each other equally as a part of the family. Other alliances, of course, existed between other nations because, again, treaty making was a part of that tradition. The Wabanaki and the Mi'kmaq, for example, Confederacy, they had a relationship and treaties with the French. The Wendat and Huron had treaties and relationships with the French and the English. The trading alliances amongst Indigenous nations and with European nations was critical for success. It also was very supportive of Indigenous nations in terms of what they needed to do and how they needed to have their relationships. So it becomes a consistency. In order for this nation of Canada to have been born, it had to have had treaty with Indigenous people. And for over 200 years, there was a relevance of Indigenous people in Canada that required these treaties to help birth what would later become Canada by working together, again, in a trusting relationship. In 1763, the Royal Proclamation recognizes, it's a very important document. Actually, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is a critical document that really creates the foundation of what would become Canada. What's important about that is that first, that it recognizes that a nation-to-nation relationship exists between Indigenous nations and the Crown, and that only the Crown and Indigenous nations can negotiate treaties. So no one else can get involved. And of course, that was also a response to American expansionism that also threatened what would become Canada early on. And so the Crown felt that it was necessary to, again, make these relationships legal, but also recognizable as foundational documents in the nation of Canada and in relationship to the Crown of England. Because Canada's legal foundation and sovereignty is built upon treaties with Indigenous nations. And in fact, we can say that Canada is a treaty nation. And so with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, that came from after the 7 Years' War between France and England in 1763. It really was that first step towards England's, or the British, control over the territories in what would become Canada. Mainly the eastern and central part of Canada from the Great Lakes towards the St. Lawrence River and outwards there. But also the Royal Proclamation does something that's really important. It recognizes Aboriginal title. Within the document itself, it says that all lands not ceded or purchased from Indigenous people actually belongs to them, and that they have a title to that land. And that becomes really important today as well, because this Royal Proclamation has been upheld in Supreme Court over and over again, and it recognizes that Aboriginal people do, in fact, have title to all public lands that exist in Canada. That is why it is necessary for the Crown, or Canada and the right of the Crown, to work with Indigenous nations, particularly when there is development or effects to treaty rights. So the Royal Proclamation gives that foundation for corporations, if they want to develop resources on traditional lands, that they speak with the Indigenous nations to which their traditional lands are being developed. So it's required by law that companies, corporations have to negotiate with the First Nations because they are, in fact, going on their traditional territory. And once again, the Royal Proclamation confirms the nation-to-nation and government-to-government relationship. And today, with the Liberal government the way that it is, it's recognizing the necessity of honoring that understanding. Because these treaties that we had made early on weren't just old documents sitting in a shelf somewhere. They really become the foundation of what Canada is. And also with the Royal Proclamation, it establishes the process of treaty making and recognizes that in order for Canada to expand and develop its own resources, that it needed to make treaties with Indigenous people. And even today, the treaty-making process is still not complete. We're still in that process of negotiating treaties and relationships with the Crown and the Government of Canada. Unfortunately, and I'll go through this quickly because we all know the story, but the birth of Canada and the birth of the Indian problem started roughly around 1812. And that is when Canada really firmly rooted itself as an up-and-coming nation. And once the struggle of the War of 1812 was over, there was a question of relevancy between Indigenous people and the new formation of what would become Canada. So that's when the dialogue started to turn. This is when Indigenous people started to lose that footing around relationship. So policies of isolation and assimilation started to be formed. And one of the early documents that came out of these conversations in 1841 was by Dr. Herman Merivale. He was a professor of political economy at Oxford and the Undersecretary of State for the Canadian colonies. And he believed that it was essential to, quote, civilize the Indian population and develop 4 policy alternatives to the Crown and how to deal with the Indian problem. One was extermination by death or enfranchisement. And the enfranchisement part means that they would be assimilated into the body politic of Canada. The other was slavery, and the other was insulation. That what they meant by that was that they would put Indigenous people in on reserves in the middle of nowhere and wait for them to die out, because this whole idea of the noble savage existed at that time as well. But the problem is that when you put Indigenous people in the wilderness, they tend to flourish and not die out. The fourth recommendation was assimilation, and that's the one that was followed and selected as the more acceptable form of dealing with the Indian problem, was to assimilate Indigenous people. And I think one of the great statements that had been said by one of our leaders in the last century, Dr. Harold Cardinal, he had said that the United States had a saying that a good Indian was a dead Indian. But in Canada, they have a saying, they said, that goes, a good Indian is a non-status Indian. So assimilation and forced assimilation became the big motivation in terms of how they were going to deal with the issues. So in 1842, after that initial report was left, the Bagot Commission, or Bagot Commission, in 1842 and 44, decided that the Crown needed to become involved in Indian education. This becomes a process of assimilation, of forced assimilation. So this first official document that paves the way for the establishment of government-funded Indian schools that would teach English language and customs and erase Indian culture. So forced assimilation and cultural genocide were really underscored in terms of what the aim was to be. But the underlying aim was the dispossession of all lands and claims to land, and it becomes the guiding principles in addressing the Indian problem. And we have to remember that foundationally, the aim was to remove Indigenous right to resources and lands. So it becomes that guiding principle. And so in 1847, Edgerton Ryerson, the father of Ontario education, and Ryerson University produces another report for the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. His recommendations become the model for Indian residential schools based on religious and domestic education. There is a need to raise the Indians to the level of the whites and take control of land out of Indian hands. So this whole age of irrelevancy became the normal for the next 100 years or so. And so earlier I stated that we are a treaty nation. And what you're looking at here is a map of Canada with the numbered treaty and the early treaties, pre and post Confederation. You can see the peace and friendship treaties. This is where we start. This is where we see the two-row wampum and the covenant chains start to be built out in eastern Canada, what is now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And then we move into the Williams Treaty, Robson Superior Treaties of the 1850s, and then also the big purple list of treaties are all the numbered treaties. That's what they're called. And so they start, and this is a real process that the Canadian government established almost down to a science, is that when they'd go in to treat with Indigenous people, they came with pre-prepared treaties that talked about ceding land and those sorts of things. But Indigenous nations who have made treaty had said there was no understanding in their communications about giving up any of their land or giving up any of their traditions. It was always about how we would share it together, how we would make room. And there is a traditional teaching, particularly within the Cree, of the word tatawao. And tatawao then means welcome, there is room. It becomes a central principle within the Indigenous perspective of treaties. So these are the numbered treaties. The next slide shows us the more modern treaties, comprehensive land claims and self-government agreements. All of these are treaties, for a lack of a better word, even though they're named differently now. The big red part of this map is what is called Nunavut. And so that is really a treaty between the Inuit and the Crown in right of the Canadian government. And so this opens up that whole northern part of Canada. And as you see, we're starting to fill in the whole map of Canada with all the different treaties that are really governing almost every single bit of Canada's landmass. In British Columbia, however, it's roughly around 65% of the total landmass of British Columbia has not been treated with as of yet. Therefore, Aboriginal title exists to the nations that live on that land, that they do have the right to pursue their livelihood within these areas. But there are processes underway where nations are negotiating treaties or modern treaties, land claims, etc., with the Crown as we speak. And when you look at the blue part up there, that is the Inuit, I believe, agreement. We have the Dene, the Satu, Dene, and Métis land claims. We have the Tlicho agreements, and then we have the James Bay and Northern Quebec treaties with the Crown. And so there's still space in Canada that hasn't been treated with, and they're being worked on now. So these are just some of the modern treaties. And a lot of people have heard about land claims and issues being fought in court and so forth and so on. It's because it goes right back to that old tradition of treaty making, but also the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So as we move forward today, treaty rights have become protected by the Constitution Act of 1982, in particular Section 35, which reads, "The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal people in Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed." Now, that's a very critical statement there. It recognizes, and for the very first time within our own Constitution, it recognizes that our treaties exist. And in fact, there should be nothing that shall abrogate or derogate from these treaties. Furthermore, it says in this act, Aboriginal peoples of Canada includes Inuit, Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. A part of the issue around using the word Indigenous, it becomes more inclusive because it also recognizes the Indigenous people who have not yet made treaty. So this an Indian, Inuit, and Métis definition is a bit limiting in terms of it doesn't encompass all Indigenous people in Canada at this point. But also the word Indian was replaced pretty much at the same time, not within the Constitution itself, with the term First Nation. Indian here means status Indian, and status Indian means the ones who belong to the nations who had made treaty. So it's status Indian, or as we now call it, First Nations people. Number 3 section here is for the greater certainty, in subsection 1, treaty rights includes rights that now exist by way of land claim agreements or may be so acquired. What this means is that treaty rights aren't only limited to be recognized by the existing treaties or the old treaties that we've been talking about, but also new ones that may need to come up, and which do need to come up if Canada is going to legitimate itself as having access to the land and the use of the land with Indigenous people. Number 4, notwithstanding any other provision of this Act, the Aboriginal treaty rights referred to in subsection 1 are guaranteed equally to male and female persons. And for the longest time, the Indian Act had treated Indigenous women as chattel, and that's the actual word that they used, that women were chattel, right up there with cattle and farm implements. That's how Indigenous women were placed within the Indian Act of Canada. Now, there is a belief that the Indian Act is created to protect these treaty rights or to support them. In fact, it does the opposite. It counters Indigenous treaty rights. That's why there's so much conflict and struggle with the Canadian government in terms of how it has been interpreting treaty rights in Canada. So treaty rights, they vary from treaty to treaty, of course, but common points include hunting, trapping, and fishing rights. It also supports cultural survival, identity, and cultural practices. When we were making treaty, particularly Treaty 8, we had many discussions with the commissioner or representatives from the government. And what we knew was important for future generations is that Indigenous youth, our Indigenous communities need to have a very strong foundation in terms of who they are and where they came from. So it didn't mean that we gave up our rights to who we were. We actually built within the understanding. The spirit and intent of the treaties was to protect our Indigenous identity and our culture, because we knew that it was required to survive in the future. But we also recognized that the Europeans had education and knowledge that we can also learn from. But going back to that idea of brothers and sisters, it was understood that we would grow together like brothers and sisters, sharing the land, learning from each other, understanding each other's ways, but never giving up the identity of who we are. We built those into our understanding of the treaty rights that were signed away. And of course, territorial land rights, economic development were also a part of the treaty-making process, because we recognized that we would not be able to survive in the way that we had because of the populations that were coming into our territories. But we knew that we had to have a foundation of economic development, which is directly connected to our rights, and therefore the territorial land rights that exist as Aboriginal title now. Education and health rights were always a large part of it as well. So we built those into our understanding of the treaties. So what exists today are still issues of interpretation, and they continue to be very hot point issues with Indigenous people. Our health rights, for example, dental and non-insured health benefits of First Nations through Health Canada. That's where we acquire these free, quote unquote, free health services. In fact, health services for Indigenous people, particularly First Nations in this case, are about 50 cents on the dollar for every Canadian that gets health care. For every dollar that's put in there, 50 cents is put in for Indigenous health care, dental issues, that sort of thing. But what happens within these health rights issues and debates with the Crown and with Health Canada is that there's a chipping away at the support of those things. There used to be a time when dental care for Indigenous, for First Nations was taken care of pretty much for all the teeth. And now they've reduced that to the back molars and other things. You don't get braces anymore. So these treaty rights had been chipped away at by Health Canada and the Department of Indian Affairs. Education was always seen as a treaty right, because we recognize that in order for us to survive in the coming times, that we would have to have a level of education that can give us a mastery of the tools of the day, and so that our children would become successful in their pursuit of their life. It was understood back when we made the treaties is that these lands that we took as reserves, and they're actually called reserved lands for Indians. And what this land base was meant to be, it wasn't meant to limit us to living on this very small patch of land, which couldn't sustain a population of more than a couple hundred. Now there's thousands of members on many reserves. It's still a very small piece of land. But what it was supposed to do was to be a place where Indigenous people or First Nations people can return to while they were out in the world pursuing their purpose. These reserved lands were there for us to return to if we wanted to retire, or if we wanted to go back and get in touch with our cultural roots. In Treaty 8 specifically, if you look at a lot of the First Nations, you'll see that they're connected to bodies of water. Usually the reserves are close to low-lying areas, not because we couldn't select good land for farming, but because that's where our medicines were. And so we would also, that would be a place where we can have access to fish and fowl, and it'll be close to our hunting territories, because the idea is that we can return there and rejuvenate ourselves and retouch with our cultures. It wasn't meant to keep us isolated there. Those changes came in at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, where they felt that Indigenous people had to be left on these reserves. That's where the pass system came in, that forced Indigenous people to stay on the First Nations. So another big issue within our treaty rights is the mobility of treaty rights. 70% of Indigenous people in Canada live in urban centers. They're no longer on their traditional territories. One is that First Nations can't hold all those people on the small patches of land that they do have. But what it's caused is issues of the mobility of treaty rights. Can we take our rights with us wherever we are? That's a hot button discussion that's happening now. Because from the Indigenous perspective, wherever we are treaty First Nations. Another important issue is the Métis as Indians decision that had just been recently released. And what they're really referring to is that Métis had to be treated as Indians. The key word here is treated. That means to make treaty. Now, they're a long way off before they do make these kinds of agreements with the Crown, but it has given them that foundation where they can be treated with as Indigenous people in Canada. So therefore, they have rights, and I think this is the precursor to them being recognized as rights-bearing people. And of course, Nunavut, as we saw on the map, is that the Inuit have their rights and their agreements built into that territorial agreement on their own behalf. So, reconciliation and treaties. Now we're at a part where as we move forward in this age of reconciliation, restitution then becomes a big part of reconciliation. Restitution from the Indigenous perspective is that part of reconciliation. Land, money, relationship, and control, or self-control, or self-government. For many years, the government of Canada had managed or put into trust lands, monies, and controlled those to a point where we did not have the right to see what was happening with our own funds. Oftentimes, parcels of land, large sums of money would disappear without any accountability. A lot of court actions that are taking place now are reclaiming those and saying, this wasn't done right, this wasn't done appropriately. So again, we hear through media that Indigenous people are looking to get more land and looking to get more money. In fact, what we're trying to do is bring balance back to that relationship. That's why control then becomes an important part. Indigenous people need to, and they have the legal right to control their own interests around their lands and their monies. So now we're starting to see a movement by the government in releasing those controls back to First Nations control. But it wasn't always that way. It was also through legal action that we had to force the hand of the Crown to honor itself and to honor its agreement. So a part of reconciliation is to reconcile the balance of those treaty rights. And that'll be a critical part of how we're going to move forward, because once again, we can have control over our own destinies in terms of how our economies are going to be created and how we're going to move forward as fully participating nations within Canada. So a part of what we also have within this reconciliation is Indigenous knowledge. once Canada recognizes that Indigenous people hold a vast amount of knowledge, they also will recognize that we have possible solutions for community, social, and individual healing and strengthening as well. And also, Indigenous people have a role in national governance and policy. Because anything that affects these treaties, Indigenous people have a responsibility and an obligation to voice their concerns, but also to voice concerns for future generations as well. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly decided in favor of Indigenous rights. So it becomes a living and dynamic agreement. Treaties aren't, again, as I can't reiterate enough, they aren't just historical documents. They're living dynamic agreements between Indigenous nations and the Crown. So what we're looking at through this reconciliation is putting the relationship back together and charting a new course. Because all Canadians are treaty people. We really do believe that. Unfortunately, Indigenous people for a very long time have not had the full benefits of their treaty rights. We have not been able to be equally sharing in the resources and the development that has taken place on our territories. So the pursuit isn't to take more than we're entitled to or more than we have identified, but it is about equity and parity. We're seeking just the basics in that. So instead of having 50 cents for our healthcare and Canadians have $1, why don't First Nations have $1 and Canadians have $1 for their health issues as well? And we know that through many current affairs that are happening now, that Indigenous schools, childcare, for example, are being severely underfunded. So if we can look back at treaties as being seen as a kinship relationship, as family, I think that really starts to set us in a path of where we can really work towards strengthening the relationship that was intended, strengthening that sacred covenant, because we need to see treaties as a sacred text, not only amongst the relationships between nations, but how Canada as a country works in relationship to all the many different communities that call Canada home. So we return to the river, going back to those first treaties, particularly with the Two-Row Wampum and the concepts of peace, respect, and friendship. If we can take the word kanata back to its original intention, to make pure, clean, and sacred, we can have a chance to rebuild a relationship that is inclusive, not just between the Crown and treaty relationships, but how Canada as a nation thinks of itself. Because Canada is a verb, Canada is a directive. Every time we see that word or hear our national anthem, we should be asking ourselves a question. What am I doing to maintain my relationships, to achieve that sacredness, that purity, and that cleanliness? How am I treating myself as an individual with the idea of peace, respect, and friendship in mind? But also, how am I creating that sacredness and purity within my own family, within the relationships I have at work, within relationships I have with the nation, with the newcomers that are here, with the environment, with the cosmos, with the spirit world. So this becomes all encompassing, and returning to the river, returning back to the very basics of our treaty relationships is going to be a critical way in which we can truly forge a new relationship, a stronger relationship with Indigenous people across Canada, but also gifting Canada and Canadians with that new idea that kanata is a way of doing things. Kanata is that positive experience in peace, respect, and friendship. The Indian Act, which is interesting, is that when you look at those previous maps I was showing you, you see the number of treaties moving across Canada. The whole treaty-making process kicks into high gear. The attitude behind that, in so many ways, was that, if we can get this treaty thing done, then we'll have access to the land and we shall be unfettered and develop it the way that we want, unbeknownst to them later on through legal actions. But at the same time as the treaty processes are really kicking into gear, it's kind of ironic that they have the treaty process here that is honoring nation to nation, sharing the land, so forth, so on, and then they create this legal implement called the Indian Act. The Indian Act then is counter to what the spirit and intent of the treaties were about. So the Indian Act actually becomes a way in which they can start to remove, bit by bit, the enfranchisement part of assimilation, to remove these treaty rights so there's no responsibility to the Crown for the well-being and support of Indigenous people. But the point is not to support Indigenous people, it's to be able to give Indigenous people the tools they need vis-a-vis the treaties in order to be self-sufficient as we always had been. So the Indian Act is probably one of the most hated documents in Canadian history, at least in Indigenous history anyway. It's sad to say, but the Indian Act was studied by two regimes that have long gone. One is the South African government in apartheid. They developed the Bundesstaats, their homeland system based on the reserve system of Canada. Also, the National Socialists had studied the legal processes and maneuvering of creating First Nations reserves, land bases, but also how to include apartheid-like or forced assimilation type policies into their own regime. So they had been taught well by the Canadian government. The irony is that the Indian Act is still here, and those two regimes are long gone. First Nation leaders, I think any self-respecting leader does not want the Indian Act to be around because it dictates everything that a First Nation has to go through in order to get things done. How to select your leaders, how to build your houses. There's 7 approval levels that First Nations have to go through just to get a house built. And then at the end of that, it's built by the cheapest bid, right? So it becomes encumbering. You can't move to address the issues that you need. Rather, you have to wait and you have to wait and you have to wait. And so the federal government, as they say, gives $8 billion to Indigenous people every year. What they fail to say is that Indigenous people, through various tax formats and the processes, pay well over $10 billion a year into the economy. But they also fail to mention that 80% of that $8 billion goes to outside sources. It doesn't deal with the issues on the reserve or the health issues that we have to. We get $1 billion split up between 630 First Nations to address the issues that we need socially. Where does the rest of that money go? Well, Indian Affairs itself, the ones who lord over the Indian Act, we have to pay for their 10,000 employees. Subcontractors and contractors have to be paid out of that sum. For example, water treatment plants on First Nations are horrendous, but the Indian Act has a policy that says you can only replace that technology with the same technology that we identify for you, even though there's other workable alternatives. So that sort of stuff still exists today. And yes, we'd like to get it rid of, but that's the only legal mechanism that exists where our Indigenous governments and our Indigenous peoples have a direct conduit into the Canadian government itself. So it has to be replaced, it has to be repealed, but something needs to be created before we can remove the Indian Act. And that's where we are now. And that might take some time in terms of identifying an Indigenous Governance Act or Treaty Implementation Act or Métis Act or Inuit Act so it's a while yet.
Thanks, Lewis. I'll just add a little bit on to that. It's interesting that you talk about needing a new document because if I recall correctly, and correct me if I make a mistake, in 1969, under the first Trudeau, there was the white paper that proposed to get rid of the Indian Act. But if I can remember my readings on this, it was very much opposed by Indigenous leaders because it was done basically unilaterally and left that vacuum. As you said, it didn't have any other sort of, it didn't create a new relationship. It basically, it was another attempt to remove that Indian status and assimilate First Nations. So
you're exactly right. Jean Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time. Trudeau was the Prime Minister, Trudeau I, or Trudeau the Elder, depending what we want to call him. He believed, because he was he studied Plato. He's a very well-schooled individual, and he thought that there would be a better and just society of Canadians. And in order to have a just society, he had to get rid of that kind of document. He was right on one principle, that the Indian Act needed to go. But what he did is unilaterally, Chrétien, a white paper is a discussion paper of what could become policy. We countered with what was called the Red Paper, Citizens Plus. And it was something that said, no. We need to recognize Indigenous rights, not eradicate them, because the White Paper was talking about getting rid of treaty rights, getting rid of the Indian Act, getting rid of the reserve system, with the idea of full integration or enfranchisement into the Canadian body politic. So that then becomes Trudeau's attempt at the last stand of attacking treaty rights again. We were very successful. My father was vice president. My uncle Harold Cardinal was the leader of the Indian Association of Alberta, with the chiefs and the elders, articulated a very coherent strategy called the Red Paper that helped to protect Indigenous rights. As a matter of fact, that Section 35 that we're talking about was inspired by Citizens Plus, by the Red Paper. So it actually goes into constitutional change. That's how forceful we eventually became. Mm-hmm. Well, because it's everything about who I am. It gives me the grounding in terms of where I come from and who I am, and even so much as what I do in my life. You know, when we talk about we're all treaty people, well, treaty people means a positive practice of relationship. And I think Canada has yet to realize its full potential, and it won't become its full potential until it recognizes the spirit and intent of the treaties, until it recognizes the values of what treaty brings for Canada. And Canada's already been heavily shaped by that Indigenous philosophy, because when you travel internationally, Canada reflects in a very positive way. It's doing some very unique things that other countries haven't done, one of which is treaties all across the land. Other countries have not done that depth of things so far. But culture is foundational to who we are. Without that, we really become dissonant. And we see that played out with Indigenous people who are not culturally grounded. They're filling up our prison systems. They're filling up our hospitals and everything else. So culture becomes a critical part of recovery. Well, I go back to a mentor and friend of mine by the name of Elijah Harper. Elijah Harper was a very powerful individual. He was a political leader from Manitoba. Red Sucker Lake is what his First Nation was named. When they first formed the TRC, I asked him a question. We were at a conference together, and I said, so what do you think of this commission? What do you think that this reconciliation thing is going to be about? And he said, we can't leave reconciliation to the hands of our political leaders, because they'll say all the right words, but nothing will really change. He said, what will change is when the people sit together and talk. So what I'm seeing now with the advent of the final report and the 94 calls to action is people sitting down at the grassroots level, really taking the time and the effort to understand what has happened, where the relationship went wrong, where we can improve things. There is a yearning by Canadians, and this is always, it doesn't surprise me, as I am awed by the fact that Canadians have a desire to make things right. I'm talking everyday Canadians. There is that innate part of Canadian identity that seeks to do the right thing. So we're seeing these discussions start to come up and around, but we're far from seeing the reconciliation happen. But it's generational work, as my grandfather would say. It took 7 generations to get us into this mess. It's going to take 7 generations to get out. But each of our generations have to create the opportunities to help develop the conversation to get that understanding. Because most Canadians, once they understand the inherent injustice that has been perpetrated against Indigenous people, they want to correct that. And that's why I have hope that reconciliation is going to take root. And because of that reconciliation, Canada will redefine itself in such a positive way that it becomes a global leader in right relations.
Thank you for that very hopeful and inspiring
thought
and message. And I think it really does, what you're saying about people's innate desire to do that is really reflected in some of those other questions, such as how can we heal together? How can we be more sensitive and respectful?
Yeah. Well, that's not to say, yes, those are rose-colored glasses in response to that. But looking at the disparity, it's still shocking, the amount of social issues that we have within our population. The racism and the continued disrespect that still exists within Canadian society. It's not to not mention them or pretend they don't exist, but those are issues that we have to talk about as a part of this reconciliation. An honest conversation always is a very emotional reality. And so those are the conversations that places my hope and how we're going to be able to overcome these things. Because if we can't identify the pain, we don't have any hope of dealing with it and effectively strategizing of how we can mutually learn from what has happened. So yeah, there's still negativity. We're still seeing so much injustice and led by racism, discrimination, and really the inoculation to that is knowledge and understanding. And you can't get that if you don't have the opportunity to have a conversation.
Well, I really appreciate you giving us an opportunity to have this conversation and think about these things and bring it to the members of ACWS and think about how in the work of our members and in the work that we do, we can create those opportunities for ourselves and for our communities. And speaking of those, having those conversations, our next session in January will be on some of those strategies and tools that we can use to build right relations. So really looking forward to that and what you have to say
for
that. And so I'll leave on that note and look forward to seeing everyone again in January. Thank you so much, Lewis, for your time and your knowledge. Again, it always leaves us sometimes with more questions, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And thank you to all of our members who took the time over their lunch hour to sit and learn with us. And hopefully we will see you next month.
Hey.